Welcome to episode 52 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
I do not want to freak you out, but your computer, it may be a zombie. Your Wi-Fi router may also be a zombie. Lots of things around your house could be zombies. Millions of internet-connected devices today are part of botnets, causing chaos around the web. Not all malware exists to steal your data. Sometimes all a hacker wants is control of your machine, so it can put it together with a bunch of other machines to do the hacker's bidding. All without you, the owner of the device, knowing that anything is wrong. With malicious networks using tens of millions of computers and devices to serve up spam, run denial of service attacks, and more, botnets are a threat we cannot ignore. 5 things to know about botnets. That's the topic of today's checklist. Specifically, what are botnets and how are they built? Why do the bad guys want botnets? How botnets communicate? We'll look at some of the biggest botnets about which we know. And finally, how to fight back against them. Let's start at the top. What are botnets and how are they built?
The simplest definition for botnets comes just from looking at the word itself. We're dealing with a network of bots, or computers acting like robots, following commands. For the most part, the machines swept up into these networks are Windows computers, thanks to the large number of exploitable vulnerabilities across its many versions. When users don't apply patches promptly, it's much easier for hackers to build botnets with Windows machines than it is with Macs. Desktop computers aren't the only devices that end up enslaved in botnets. In fact, botters might be moving away from them as a dominant source for zombie devices. The growth of the Internet of Things and the lack of strong security in many of those consumer devices makes them an appealing target. We've covered security and the Internet of Things on episode 42 of the checklist. Now, just a few years ago, a botnet of several 100,000 IoT devices was built on the back of a vulnerability in a refrigerator. For those living with smart home devices, you might never know that your fridge is part of an international spam ring pumping out millions of phony emails a day. The well-publicized Mirai botnet that took down some ISPs this year is another good example of that. IoT products, business workstations, laptops, desktops, if it connects to the web, someone will try to put it in a botnet. Now, before we dig into what botmasters do with the computing power available to them, how do they even come to control so many machines in the first place? The answer, it's malware, of course, but it comes in a more layered, sophisticated package than you'd expect from something designed to target one machine or the individual user. In these cases, the botmaster rarely cares about who owns or uses the device they enslave. Instead, they might prefer to target enterprise-level computers in businesses or governments. Why? Well, those computers are often the same across the board, sharing security patches and operating systems. That means any vulnerability in one makes it probably a vulnerability in other machines nearby. Scanning local networks and jumping to infect those PCs is easy for botnet malware. That's one way for malware to end up on a hard drive. Of course, there are other ways, including malicious emails, drive-by downloads, and so on. Those same methods can be used against regular home users as well. Some bad guys use an initial Trojan horse to make their way onto a target machine. This Trojan either acts as a dropper to deploy the botnet payload, or it opens the door to the command and control server to send the correct software to the machine. Some Trojans even delete themselves to avoid detection later, leaving behind the harder to find malware. After entrenching itself on a computer, it may then begin to scan for more machines or go straight to engaging in malicious activity.
You see, when you say malicious activity, that starts to get us to the next question. I mean, you've covered some of the how. Let's hit the why. What do these bad guys even want with these botnets?
Well, lots of things. These are bad guys with thousands or millions of computers secretly under their control. They might send spam. They might steal data from the host computers, in the case of a smaller targeted botnet. They might blast out emails filled with more malware to help build the network, probe other computers for vulnerabilities, or, as we see more and more often, they might engage in a distributed denial of service attack.
Well, now I know we already hit the how question, but I mean, I want to come back to it a tiny bit. If my computer is being used for something like this, how do I not know that?
Well, for starters, they might not be using your computer. They might be using your Wi-Fi router or your smart thermostat. How can you run an anti-malware program on those? Botnets built on devices like those are hard to detect and harder to purge due to the inaccessibility of the system. As far as how you could miss it on your computer, hackers try to do as little as possible with each machine. For example, let's look at a botnet built for racking up advertising dollars through fraud. Instead of waiting for real people to see the ads in question, they deploy malware that controls a user's web browser and directs its traffic to the places the botmaster chooses. Obviously, a flood of requests that slows down a user's connection or takes over their browser would be detected. The bad guys need a subtler approach, so these actions usually take place in hidden or background processes. They access only enough browser resources on each machine to send a few requests. But a few requests on each of a million machines adds up to a lot of money. Spam is the goal in other cases, with botted machines acting as SMTP, or email servers. Anti-spam methods have grown considerably in recent years, and it's easy to spot tons of bad email coming from a block of IP addresses or a given geographical area. With a botnet, no machine sends more than a few requests at a time, and the IP addresses can vary. With bots around the world, a spam network can send millions to billions of emails a day, sometimes packing in the very same malware that generated them in the first place. Finally, some botnets are built for others to use, like a botnet for hire. By some estimates, botnet owners can make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year leasing their enslaved networks to spammers, identity thieves, and other cybercriminals.
Okay, so now we know how the botnets are built. We know why the botnets are built. How do the people who run them actually run them?
It all happens through a process called command and control, or CNC. To succeed in disrupting or bringing down a botnet, it's almost always necessary for a security team to figure out how the bots are getting their orders. Over the past decade or so, these methods have undergone some substantial changes. The most basic way for bots to phone home to their boss is by using IRC, or Internet Relay Chat. It's a protocol that some of our older listeners may know well. The hackers set up one or several IRC servers that bots then communicate with, sending back very low bandwidth messages that are less likely to draw attention from a user or the system. These messages may report status, while the botmaster may issue new commands to the botnet. IRC command and control, it's cheap, it's effective, it allows for rapid channel switching, like jumping between different chat rooms every few minutes. This method allows for continuous instruction while avoiding detection. That said, IRC is a weak method for CNC today, and it's straightforward for researchers to cut off IRC-controlled botnets after identifying the servers in question. Something as simple as keyword blocking or cutting off access to the IRC port on infected machines can render them completely inaccessible to the botmaster. As a result, many hackers have moved on to other, more sophisticated methods for communication with their electronic slaves. Bots might disguise their communication as HTTPS traffic, usually to the controlling server, because it looks like regular web traffic. It's not always easy for the good guys to pick out the bad traffic and filter it out. A similar but even more subtle method involves the actual TCP network packets sent off your machine. By altering the header information of each packet just by a small amount, bots can send encoded messages back to their master and vice versa. Sometimes there's nothing special about the way bots communicate. They just send basic requests to the bad guys' servers. Now, most local anti-malware solutions won't think to look in this space for illicit commands. Thankfully, outbound network security is improving by leaps and bounds, and strict rules about what packets contain can help mitigate this threat. Called egress filtering, packets that don't look right aren't allowed to exit onto the internet. On the bot herder side, their CNC servers often feature a customized control panel. A hacker might be able to see at a glance how many machines are active on the network and whether any of them have grabbed any desirable data. They also use these control panels to send updates or make changes to the bot malware. For example, when renting use to another customer, a hacker might receive payment to drop a keylogger on a machine in a given area. Through his control panel, he could send a new malware dropper to the devices in question. That's just one example, of course. They could be sending spam or just searching for new machines to infect. Sometimes CNC takes a more secretive route to a user machine, rather than communicating directly with the server. Bots might leverage a P2P or peer-to-peer network made from other zombie machines. Some bots that receive instructions then work to locate other infected computers to pass along the instructions. Some malware authors have even taken to using social media to issue command to bots. The easiest example of this is Twitter. Here, a hacker directs bots to routinely access the syndication feed for a Twitter account they also control. From there, they tweet encoded commands that look like gibberish to anyone observing. As the bots check in with Twitter, they see new commands inside the tweets and change their behaviors accordingly. They may act as a middleman, directing bots to a new CNC server domain to avoid detection or when their old servers go down.
Okay, so now we've got botnets in theory. We've got the how, we've got the why. More how, I think. Let's talk about practice, though. What are some of the biggest botnets about which we know?
Mirai is one we talk about a lot. Well, it's not one of the biggest. The Mirai botnet used less than 1 million compromised devices. Its damage was huge. Even several 100,000 machines taking orders from a botmaster can wreak havoc, as we saw when Mirai was commanded to flood DNS provider DIN. With hijacked baby monitors and web-connected security cameras, major websites went offline. Users around the world found their daily web browsing disrupted and soon learned a botnet was to blame. While it's not causing more major and visible problems right now, Mirai is still out there, and there have even been some new variants of the core malware popping up over recent months. The biggest botnet that we know of so far hit several years ago. In 2009 and 2010, a botnet known as Bretolab infected as many as 30 million computers by some estimates. Other botnets have been nearly that big, but none have beaten Bretolab in terms of sheer numbers. Users were first infected primarily through malicious email attachments. They'd receive emails claiming they'd been given an iTunes gift certificate, or that they had missed a delivery on a package from UPS. Once downloaded, the Trojan communicated with its CNC server to download a vast range of additional malware. From keyloggers to fake antivirus software and more, Bretolab pushed tons of dangerous data onto infected machines, all for money. The master of the Bretolab botnet farmed out portions of it to customers paying to rent the botnet, allowing them to send their own malware to infected machines. At its peak, Bretolab could send out more than 3.5 billion viral spam messages every day. Ultimately, authorities seized the central CNC servers for Bretolab, slowing its rise. However, many machines likely remained infected for years afterward, and some continued to remain under the control of far-flung servers in Russia. Even so, it was a quick and efficient end to the biggest botnet ever. Another example was the Configure worm. The malware itself was advanced, and exploited Windows vulnerabilities to entrench itself on infected systems. Its extreme virulence led it to infect millions of PCs. Today, estimates of the Configure botnet size range from a few million to nearly 10 million, with a capacity to potentially send 10 billion spam emails in a day. Since its arrival, researchers have worked hard to limit the botmaster's ability to exploit the network. After successfully hampering Configure's ability to receive new instructions from its CNC servers, the authors switched to using a custom peer-to-peer network. Almost 10 years later, Configure is still around, and researchers continue to watch and examine its evolution. So far, the full might of the botnet has never been unleashed on any target that we know of, and with a dedicated group fighting back against it, we can be hopeful that such a day will never come. As interesting and perhaps intimidating as big botnets can be, you don't need millions of machines to build a botnet worth renting out to other cybercriminals. Create something that enslaves any reasonable number of computers, and the bad guys can still do what they want, and maybe even avoid detection in the process. After all, the bigger a botnet grows, the more intense scrutiny it receives. For many, it's better to fly under the radar. For that reason, the efforts to push back against bot herders is important.
So then let's do that part. How do we actually fight back against botnets and the people who bought them?
The first line of defense is obvious. Prevent infections from occurring in the first place. That's not always possible, especially when malware relies on obscure or zero-day exploits to spread rapidly. Once someone has established a botnet and begins to use it, or rent it out, that's when the second line of defense comes in. That's the work done by white hat hackers and security researchers to figure out a way to cut off the botmaster's access to his zombie machines. There are a few ways to do that. One example. We mentioned earlier that when a botnet uses IRC, blocking connections or closing the affected ports can help. Identifying bot traffic before it leaves the user system is also a handy method. Unfortunately, these only help with a few individual machines at a time. To make a bigger breakthrough and neutralize a botnet's ability to push more malware, researchers need a more direct way of stopping a botnet's command and control. One of the best ways for the good guys to do this, and to learn more about the malware and its tools in the process, is by pretending to be the CNC server. Sometimes called sinkholing, the basic idea is to stand in for the botmaster by masquerading as the correct server. Sinkholing can happen in a couple of ways. First, researchers might notice that a botnet doesn't have its CNC server set up yet. Sure, this is a rookie mistake, but even hackers slip up sometimes. Though it wasn't a botnet, the WannaCry ransomware was killed with this method after security pros discovered that there was a kill switch domain hidden inside the code. By capturing the domain and setting up a server to collect data for analysis, we can effectively neuter the botnet's ability to cause problems. Second, researchers might be able to sinkhole a domain thanks to a friendly ISP. While many hackers set up botnet domains with registrars unlikely to shut off their service, concrete proof can stir some providers to action. In this case, it's as simple as replacing the illegitimate server with one controlled by researchers. Now, the botnet phones home to the server it expects, but it receives nothing in return. The malware just dumps all its data right into the hands of researchers. When enough data has fallen into their sinkhole, they just kill the server. Sinkholing can cut off large swaths of the botnet from the master, or even leave the entire network unable to communicate. While not as permanent a solution as removing the offended malware from specific machines, it gets the job done. Even the FBI has used this solution in the past to kill botnets, or at least render them mostly inert. In some cases, the reverse engineering work done via syncholling or by examining a piece of the botnet malware will reveal built-in kill codes that can shut down the botnet. Even cybercriminals are wary of creating a network that grows out of control, not to mention the fact that other bad guys might try and steal and take over a well-established botnet. For that reason, hackers sometimes encode these shutdown commands to allow them greater control over their networks. When researchers uncover these, they can impersonate the CNC server and tell the malware to stop functioning. Despite all these efforts, we still see new botnets arriving on the scene and growing larger every year. There's no doubt that researchers and hackers are locked in a kind of arms race over their implementation and mitigation. While the average home desktop or laptop user does not have too much to worry about, as botters predominantly target enterprise-level systems or other insecure devices, there's a clear need to remain aware of the threat. Even as Macs remain relatively immune to botnet-building malware, we know how quickly that can change. So, as always, it's important to keep a good, up-to-date anti-malware suite running on your machines.
Now, we mentioned a couple of past episodes earlier in the show. If you want to find those and notes for those shows and notes for this episode, the place to do that is securemac.com/checklist. The address again is securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask, or if there's a topic that you would like to hear us hit, we do have an email address we'd love for you to use. It is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.